In the year 1453, you are a young mother living inside Constantinople. The huge walls that had protected your city for more than 1,000 years are now crumbling under the fire of Ottoman cannons. Your husband died 3 days ago while defending those very walls. Now the Turkish soldiers are breaking down your door, and you are holding your little daughter in your arms, knowing that what is going to happen will make his death seem almost like a blessing. For 6 centuries, the Ottoman Empire was conquering territories on 3 continents. From the gates of Vienna to the deserts of Yemen, they are remembered for the marvels of architecture, such as the Blue Mosque, and for the brilliant tactics of the military sultans who shaped the course of history. But there was also the other side of the Ottoman expansion, which historians often left hidden in dusty archives. It was the systematic approach to conquest, which made weapons reach into the most intimate aspects of human life. When Constantinople finally fell on May 29, 1453, the forces of Sultan Mehmed did not simply plunder and retreat. At that moment, a carefully planned process began, which had nothing to do with military necessity but everything to do with systematic exploitation. It was not chaos nor uncontrolled violence, but a policy carried out with bureaucratic precision in hundreds of conquered cities and towns. Byzantine chroniclers described these scenes as nightmares. Ottoman records, however, present the same events as routine administrative procedures. The protocol was extremely effective. Men and boys over the age of 12 were systematically executed, not in fierce fighting but in organized groups after surrender. It was not only about eliminating soldiers. Even boys as young as 6 were killed if they showed signs of possible resistance. The Ottomans believed that leaving men alive, even children, would cause problems in the future. But death was mainly for men. Women and young girls faced something even worse. Ottoman military law, preserved in documents still kept in Turkish archives, established clear procedures for what they called the processing of the population. Women were immediately divided into categories according to age, physical condition, and perceived value. The sorting was often carried out in public squares, in front of burning churches or ruined public buildings, to create maximum psychological impact on both the victims and the rest of the people. Young women between 14 and 25 were considered the most valuable group. Ottoman records from the conquest of Constantinople mention 2,000 women in this category, each given a number and a market value. These were not abstract statistics. They were human beings entered into account books as if they were cattle. The second group included women between 25 and 40, considered suitable for physical labor but past the prime age for other purposes. The third group, women older than 40, were executed immediately, just like men who were too old to justify food and transport costs. Children were treated separately. Boys under the age of 6 were placed into the Devshirme system, a systematic program of cultural and religious conversion into the empire. Girls under 12 were put into what Ottoman records euphemistically called training programs, designed to prepare them for roles in the imperial hierarchy. The psychological warfare in these measures was as carefully planned as any military campaign. Families were forced to watch the sorting. Mothers saw their daughters put into groups, knowing they would never see them again. Ottoman soldiers deliberately separated mothers from infants, not for practical reasons but to cause maximum emotional pain. Crying babies were often killed immediately, not because they were dangerous but to show complete power over the mothers. The message was clear. Resistance meant watching your children die. The scale of the events in Constantinople became the model for understanding the methods of conquest practiced by the Ottoman Empire. In less than 48 hours after the fall of the city, around 50,000 people were classified into these categories. About 12,000 women and girls were placed on ships and transported to slave trade markets in Ankara and other Ottoman cities. Another 8,000 were distributed among the victorious soldiers as their personal property. What makes the systematic nature of Ottoman practices truly terrifying is their methods of record-keeping. The empire maintained detailed documentation because these were not random crimes of war. They were planned economic operations that required careful calculation. Ship manifests from this period list human cargo next to jade, spices, and precious metals. A typical entry might read, 20 bales of Damascus jade, 40 pepper, 15 women aged 16 to 20 years, perfect condition. In such documents, women were not even given names, only their age, physical description, and market value. The economic network that supported this system stretched across the entire Ottoman Empire. Specialized fairs in major cities had designated areas for trading human beings, with fixed price structures that shifted depending on supply and demand. A young Greek or Serbian girl might be sold for 20 to 30 silver coins, while African women carried different prices depending on their origin and physical features. The Ottomans did not invent slavery, but they industrialized it in ways previous empires had never achieved. They created standardized procedures for buying, transporting, and selling, operating with the efficiency of modern corporations. Records of sales, transport, and inventory survived in Ottoman archives, documenting human suffering with the same precision as any other commercial activity. Perhaps most disturbing was the fact that the system fueled itself. The success of Ottoman military campaigns was measured not only by the land they conquered, but also by the number of people they captured. Commanders were rewarded with bonuses depending on both the quantity and quality of prisoners. This encouraged direct attacks on civilians as much as on enemy armies. The psychological effect on the remaining population was exactly what Ottoman planners intended. Villages and towns that had seen these practices often surrendered without resistance when Ottoman forces appeared on the horizon. The empire's reputation for systematic cruelty became a weapon more powerful than cannons or cavalry. Women who survived the first selections were forced to travel across the empire, and each destination carried its own forms of cruelty. Those destined for the slave trade were transported on specially designed ships adapted for carrying human cargo. Archaeological evidence from shipwrecks shows ventilation systems, water storage, and waste management meant to keep human cargo alive during voyages lasting weeks. These vessels were floating prisons and also laboratories of dehumanization. Women lost their names and personal belongings that could remind them of their past lives. They were assigned numbers and issued basic clothing that marked their status. The process was designed to break psychological resistance before they even reached their destination. Ottoman records show that mortality during transport averaged about 15%, losses considered acceptable by administrators who treated people only as economic assets. Those who died at sea were simply thrown overboard. Their deaths were noted in account books next to spoiled grain or damaged cargo. The Ottoman approach to conquered women demonstrates a level of systematic planning that undermines everything we imagine about medieval warfare. This was not random brutality or cultural misunderstanding. It was a deliberate policy applied across centuries and continents, aimed at turning people into merchandise and terrifying entire populations into obedience. And the real horror was not limited to the moments of conquest. It continued afterward, when the systematic exploitation of women became part of the very foundation of Ottoman administration. The empire's legal system transformed rape into marriage, murder into justice, and slavery into divine order. Ottoman legal codes explicitly legalized all possible forms of sexual violence across the empire. These were not exceptions to the rules or violations of the law. They were the law itself. The concept of military wives became a central instrument in the strategy of Ottoman expansion. When a warrior was killed in battle against the Ottoman forces, his widow automatically became the property of the man who struck him down. This was not just an informal custom. It was a codified legal doctrine with specific steps for gaining property rights. The process of obtaining these rights required 3 witnesses and had to occur within 72 hours after the husband's death. After that period, other soldiers could contest the claim, leading to disputes over women in the same way as conflicts over cattle. Ottoman military courts kept detailed records of these arguments, treating them as standard property disputes. But legal ownership was only the beginning. Turning women into military wives required a systematic destruction of their former identity. Their names were immediately changed, often replaced by Turkish versions bearing no resemblance to their birth names. Religious conversion was compulsory, carried out through methods that combined mental torment with the forced study of religion. The conversion process included public ceremonies where women were forced to renounce their old faith, sometimes by spitting on sacred symbols or burning holy texts from their former lives. Those who resisted faced harsh punishments aimed at breaking their will. The empire maintained conversion centers in large cities, designed specifically for processing women. Archaeological excavations in Bursa and Adrianople uncovered the remains of buildings with special chambers, drainage systems, and disabling devices, illustrating psychological warfare on an industrial scale. These centers operated for decades, processing thousands of women under standard programs intended to erase cultural memory and replace it with total submission. Such programs often lasted 6 months, long enough to ensure pregnancy through systematic rape, creating biological ties that psychologically prevented escape. Children born of these forced unions were subjected to their own form of systematic exploitation. Offspring of mixed parentage were often killed immediately if they resembled the mother too strongly, serving as unwanted evidence of rape. Survivors were raised to serve the empire, never learning their true names or the culture of their mothers. The psychological war extended beyond individuals to entire populations. The Ottomans deliberately emphasized how they treated violated women by spreading detailed reports throughout the lands they intended to conquer. The reputation of systematic sexual violence became a weapon more effective than any military invention. Villages often surrendered without fighting rather than see their women subjected to the documented Ottoman procedures. Imperial chroniclers proudly wrote about cities that gave up instantly after hearing what had happened to women in previously conquered territories. Fear became their most powerful military tool, but surrender offered no protection. The Ottomans understood that it was easier to rule a terrorized people than a thankful one. Even cities that submitted voluntarily often saw their women exploited in the same systematic way, justified as necessary for the safety of the empire. The Devshirme system formalized this exploitation on a vast scale. The famous levy that collected boys also included groups of girls, although this part is less remembered in history. Young girls were seized from Christian families under the same legal basis as boys, but their fate was completely different. While boys could rise to positions of power in the Ottoman administration, girls disappeared into systems of sexual and reproductive slavery. Ottoman records state that nearly 40% of the girls taken in the Devshirme died within the first year of bondage. Those who survived systematic abuse, documented by their captors with bureaucratic accuracy, were forced to live in controlled farms, managed like livestock to bear children for the empire. Breeding programs operated in centers throughout Ottoman lands, where registers recorded pregnancy rates, life expectancy, mortality, infant deaths, and reproductive capacity. The empire's treatment of its captives reveals mathematical calculations of human misery embedded in the system. Ottoman officials calculated the best age to seize girls, the most effective ways to break psychological resistance, and the precise balance between exploitation and survival to keep reproductive populations functioning. These figures appear in administrative documents that treated human suffering as engineering problems requiring technical answers. The cold precision of these records and the factual descriptions of torture and rape show how systematic dehumanization became normalized in imperial culture. The economic forces that sustained the system created a cycle of conversion that grew stronger over time. Army commanders who captured valuable women received bonuses and rewards. Slave traders who provided high-quality women received preferential treatment in imperial contracts. The entire military and administrative system of the empire depended on the systematic exploitation of conquered populations. And this was not limited to the battlefield. Ottoman forces regularly carried out raids on neighboring territories, especially with the aim of seizing women and children for the needs of the empire. These raids were organized according to seasonal schedules, intended to maximize the number of captives while at the same time reducing the risks of open military conflict. Entire communities lived in constant fear of raids during the harvest season, when families could be destroyed from one day to the next. The raids were prepared with military precision and supported by intelligence networks that identified the most valuable targets. Ottoman scouts spent long months mapping villages, recording the most attractive women and the healthiest children, and planning routes that allowed them to capture the largest numbers while avoiding serious battles. The psychological effect of living permanently under the threat of raids shaped whole societies and cultures. Parents sometimes deliberately scarred the faces of their daughters or broke their limbs to make them less appealing to Ottoman invaders. The empire created a world where loving families felt compelled to harm their own children to protect them from an even worse fate. Some communities developed extensive systems of hiding places, with underground chambers and shelters in forests, where women and children could escape during raids. But the Ottomans adapted to these strategies, using torture to force villagers to reveal the hiding places, turning strategies of survival into deadly traps. The systematic approach of the empire to sexual violence caused cultural shifts that lasted long after the decline of Ottoman rule. Entire regions developed customs and traditions specifically to protect women from capture. Social structures were constantly shaped by the threat of abduction and rape. These cultural responses reveal the true scale and duration of Ottoman practices. When whole communities reorganized themselves around the defense of women against systematic sexual violence, such violence became a defining part of their very existence. Documentation of these practices survived because the Ottomans did not view their actions as shameful. They recorded their procedures with the same attention to detail as they gave to taxation or military planning, preserving evidence of systematic cruelty that lasted for centuries. The records of the empire reveal something even more disturbing than the violence itself. They kept meticulous records of the reproductive capacity of enslaved women across their territories. These were not crude notes but developed registers that monitored pregnancy cycles, outcomes of childbirth, and the long-term productivity of what they referred to as human inventory. Women who survived capture and transportation were given identification numbers and placed into specially designed facilities intended for maximum reproductive efficiency. Ottoman architects created standardized blueprints for these structures, which appeared throughout the empire with identical systems optimized for surveillance and control of captives. The complexes contained small individual cells connected by corridors, enabling guards to monitor every movement. Central areas were designed as controlled spaces for exercise, intended to maintain the physical health required for childbearing. Specialized medical facilities supported the process of reproduction, not for the benefit of women, but for the protection of imperial investment. Surviving medical documents from these centers show that women were treated as breeding livestock. Doctors employed by the empire developed techniques for increasing pregnancy rates and reducing infant mortality. These innovations were based entirely on economic interests, not on humanitarian concern. The empire's management of enslaved populations reached an industrial scale. Women were classified by age, health, and reproductive record. Those who were considered most valuable for breeding received better nutrition and medical attention. Older women or those unable to bear children were moved into labor camps where conditions were intentionally harsh. Psychological manipulation in these facilities was just as systematic as the physical control. Women were told that their families were dead, with evidence of destroyed villages presented to them. The aim was to destroy all hope of rescue or return, making resistance seem pointless. Ottoman officials discovered that women who believed their past lives were completely erased were more submissive and less likely to attempt escape. The empire invested significant resources in maintaining these psychological illusions. Realizing that mental control was often more effective than physical chains, children born in these centers faced predetermined destinies based on gender and physical traits. Boys who showed promise were often taken into Ottoman military or administrative systems once they reached the age of 5 or 6. Girls were assessed for their potential as future wet nurses or household servants. The separation itself was designed to traumatize the mothers, serving both practical and psychological functions. Women who lost their children to imperial systems became more dependent on the emotional bonds with their captors. This deliberate strategy reduced the number of escapes and uprisings. These systematic separations produced generations of people who never knew their true families or origins. The empire intentionally broke family ties in order to prevent the creation of resistance networks and to guarantee loyalty to Ottoman systems. The systematic exploitation of women by the Ottoman Empire was not an accidental deviation of medieval warfare. It was a deliberate policy, functioning for more than 6 centuries, and documented in imperial records with bureaucratic precision. These practices shaped the lives of millions of people, caused cultural traumas lasting for generations, and serve as a reminder of how quickly societies can normalize the unthinkable when absolute power is left unchecked. The archives remain preserved and await historians willing to confront this inconvenient truth.